Hello, I'm Barry Tyndall of Falls Church, Virginia. I'm honored today to have a conversation with Jim Kozlowski on behalf of the Legends in Parks and Recreation program sponsored by the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration. Jim and I came together in early October 1980 when he joined the staff of the National Recreation and Park Association's Division of Public Policy. Thus, it's been a personal honor and professional good fortune to have worked with Jim for almost 30 years now and to have this conversation with him. Jim is presently associate professor in the department of, or the school rather, excuse me, of Recreation, Health, and Tourism at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. A young university, but growing quickly, and now one of the top 3 universities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Jim, you've had an interesting, more than interesting career in public parks and recreation, mostly, both directly and indirectly. Well, tell me about the young Jim Kozlowski growing up in the great Northeast of Philadelphia. Is there part of that life that ultimately led you to a career in the law or in public recreation and parks, or generally the career, both most of the good fortunes that have come out of your life?
Well, the law certainly wasn't part of that, but growing up in Northeast Philadelphia, some of my earliest memories were the little neighborhood park, Tacony Park, that my dad would always take us to the park. That was always a treat. And I can recall walking on these downed trees, a nice day in the park, and I checked back historically, and it was Hurricane Hazel had done some storm damage to the park, took some big old trees down, and I would have been 3 years old at the time, and it was still one of my vivid memories. And I can recall when they installed brand new playground equipment, and the kids would actually line up to get rides on the various pieces of equipment. And as I got older and got into sports, my dad worked in a factory and had quite a commute outside of Philadelphia. But in good weather, as soon as he would come in the door, we'd be off to the park. He'd hit me fly balls, and every season was governed by football, basketball, or baseball, and all centered around the parks, the schoolyards in the area. And not too far from my home, we had Pennypack Park, just part of the Fairmount Park system. And that was more the resource base. There was a creek there, and I can remember my dad taking me an old bamboo pole and first, going fishing there, and later with friends going fishing, and even into high school. My high school father, Judge, actually backed up on Pennypack Park. So when for the cross country and the like, we utilized the park. So the park was always sort of a focus, not only for myself, but my dad. He'd say, "I'm going for a walk," and that would usually be, he'd go for a walk in Pennypack Park. And so I even, said that little neighborhood park, Tacony Park, there was a neighborhood group still in existence, Holmesburg Boys Club, for the sports, again, baseball, football, basketball, and our home fields were in Tacony Park and into Holmesburg Ramblers Field. So your sense of community and geography was the various parks. So in the sports leagues, when you go to play another team, it was, to this day I can still envision Northeast Philly determined by And we were fortunate in having, close to home park resources, which, my experience now professionally is that most people, they're not going to get to, Yellowstone or Yosemite, but the real recreational experiences and memories are defined by those little local parks. In fact, on my computer, I have a Google map of the old neighborhood, and in the center is Tacony Park, which has changed quite a bit, but still the same, and not a imposing resource, really just a square block with a basketball court, baseball field. The old days had a little pavilion and the like, but I didn't realize it at the time, but how much my education, if you will, occurred outside of the traditional classroom. I can recall even before I started school, when I was 5, we'd go to a local schoolyard in the summer in the mornings, and it was some variation of a summer, gathering where, you'd play kickball and sing songs, and they'd give you points if you did good things, and at the end of the summer, you'd kind of purchase, they gathered little trinkets and gifts that people donated, and you'd have sort of milk and pretzels in the morning, and and again, that was even before I started school, and the various rec centers that we would go to. Again, all Philadelphia. I learned to swim at Max Meyer's pool, which was a free public pool. My dad gave all of his time that he could, but really there was no money to go in terms of recreational opportunities.
Yeah.
So we really took advantage of was the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation System. At the time I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah.
But now I appreciate how much a big influence it had on my life. But
Yeah.
it took me a long time to actually realize that and get back into it.
I know that you have worked very hard to make sure that you and your wife Yamira have provided recreation opportunities for your 3 children, but tell me a little bit more about your family context, whether, as there were in mine, drives to the Jersey Pines or the Atlantic Coast, or a little more distant places, or was
Well, actually, until I went away to college in Baltimore, it was fairly typical of growing up in the Northeast. Nobody leaves. The exotic place to go, my grandfather had a house in South Jersey on the Bay side near Wildwood, the Villas. And I can recall I think my dad only got like a week of vacation, and we were going to go to visit my grandfather, and the old car we had problems. We didn't even get across the bridge, and so we were totally depressed. We weren't going to get to go to the shore we'd been looking forward to, and I can recall, well, where did we go when we went home? And I know my dad was very disappointed in not being able to take us. Well, we went down to the park, and we, there was a baseball game going on down there, and watched the game. So, the little local park was sort of a refuge, a place to go, just to relax or do something. So as far as, again, it was, free recreation close to home.
Yeah.
Really didn't, there were resources for, I can recall, I think it was for a 4-year span, we didn't even have a car, so we maximized and it was, given the nature of the community, most things were within walking distance or public transportation. So I didn't feel deprived or any hardship in that sense.
You're aware, of course, that my mother was born in the neighborhood where you grew up, and before it even became officially Philadelphia. She was born in 1907 and lived there for the first 4 years of her life. So I'm sure we are probably, or at least my mother and your grandparents are probably relatives and related, so we may be related too, Jim.
Yeah, when you
I hate to
mentioned
break that to you, but
the neighborhood, my mother grew up right off of Broad Street, and then when she moved to the Northeast before I was born,
the
my
great
sister,
Northeast.
yeah, the great Northeast. My sister was too. To her, that was sort of the outskirts. But to this day, I mean, I still look at the newspapers, the Philly papers, and the little local newspaper that I think it was called the Mayfair Times. Now it's the Northeast Times.
Yeah.
And get a kick out of seeing references to the streets or, the parks and public places that we took advantage of.
I think I'm correct in observing that you're the first family member to graduate from high school and then go on to college, or
Well,
did your sister precede you?
Yeah, my mom, she graduated from high school. My dad's dad, my grandfather, died when he was only 13, so he had to drop out of school in the 8th grade. But he was always interested in education, and he was, one of the smartest guys I've ever knew, but just didn't have that opportunity. My sister graduated from college, but later on.
Yeah.
So aside from my uncle and cousins who were in the religious orders, went to post-high school education.
Yeah.
I was the first one to not only go to college, but to leave Philadelphia was, I can recall both my folks, and I can understand now they didn't want me to leave home.
Yeah.
But they were like, well, we have everything you would want here in Philadelphia, although most of the schools in the Northeast involved either going downtown to Temple or even all the way across town and main line to places like, Villanova or St. Joe's. So,
Well, how I know you went to what most people who are aware of the Johns Hopkins University would consider to be an elite university. How did your journey from Northeast Philadelphia ultimately get you down the turnpike, if you will, to Baltimore?
well, it was, and in fact, I had an interview, and I still sort of have to pinch myself that I even got in and was accepted. But I believe I was in grade school, 7th grade, and I'd come back from a football game played in, and there was the old College Bowl was on the TV, and I was watching it. It was Johns Hopkins University, and they showed a little film of the campus, and even back then the competitors, were sort of nerdy. It was all guys at the time, but they just struck me as really sharp. I mean, they were just smart guys, and they talked about the school, and for some reason that sort of stuck in my mind. And so on a flyer, I got an application, and I applied. And again, my folks weren't really excited about me even applying, and they said, well, it cost almost what my dad made in a year to go there at the time. I said, well, you can't go there, we can't afford it. And I went down, I had an interview. Actually, my uncle was on his way to DC, and I went down with him and had the interview. Um, and 2 weeks later, I still have the letter, and then my daughter put it in a frame with her letter of acceptance to Johns Hopkins. She just graduated, and it said, well, if you want, we would like you to come join our class, and we provide this sort of financial aid. And I can still recall showing my dad the letter and saying, hey, it's going to be less expensive for me to go to Hopkins than to be a day hop student at Temple, where I probably wouldn't have, 50% of the class, a friend of mine started, it's, wound up dropping out. My pop said, well, hey, pack your bags, you're ready to go. So, it was the financial aid package that Hopkins offered that enabled me to go there. But that was, at 17, I was a little young to go to college. It was a year earlier than most. Going to Baltimore, where the furthest you'd ever been away was Wildwood, that was a big step. And to be around all different kinds of, it was all male at the time, all different kinds of guys, mostly from the East Coast, but Northeast Philly, even to this day, is pretty insular as far as the people there.
I think I recall you telling me that the advisor or some of the admissions counselor at Johns Hopkins said, well, Mr. Kozlowski, if you come to Johns Hopkins, you'll realize you're amongst a better prepared group of high school graduates.
Yeah, I was from a big diocesan high school, Father Judge. I had over 700 guys in my class. We'd have 58 in a class. And he said, well, as opposed to the prep schools in the Philadelphia area, they really didn't accept too many people, so that he thought I had the ability, but I would be, kind of behind the 8 ball to start off, which clearly was the case. It was a rigorous 4 years.
And you majored in English literature.
Well, it was at the time they had, and to this day, one of the interesting aspects of Hopkins, they had at the time what were called area majors. So I was a humanistic studies major. So that allowed me to actually take more English literature courses than an English major, but I didn't have to take the second language and the Western Civ and all that sort of thing. I can recall sort of humorous, the first transcript I got, when they changed to these area majors, they couldn't fit humanistic studies, so it said major, it said human stud, and they eventually corrected that.
Thought they were referring to you?
That was
that was a heady,
a
heady reference.
Sort of complimentary.
I've hired a few young people, or did hire during my career, a lot of young people for National Recreational Park Association Public Policy, and my first question in an interview was always, can you write? And I think I sort of shocked some of these park and rec majors that they'd have to answer that question right out of the barrel. Leaping ahead, of course you couldn't foresee how writing would be such an important part of your life necessarily, but how do you perceive the written word and as basis of communication? Of course, it's changing now, but I have to presume that you think that's more broadly than your work is critical in the park and recreation field.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like many people entering Johns Hopkins, I was a short-lived pre-med major, and in fact, many of my friends from high school were applying to elite universities around the country. One of the things that we dreaded was the quote writing sample, because we all were thought, you know, we just can't write that well. And
Yeah.
it, sort of the math science thing would be our ticket. And when that didn't work out, in shifting the humanities, it was all reading and intense writing. And frankly, I mean, I struggled mightily for 4 years and beyond, trying to constantly improve my writing, because most of my courses involved a lot of writing. And then later, well, before I went with NRPA, I was with the federal government Social Security Administration. I started out with in a branch office in Baltimore City, and I was going to night law school at the time, and I got a position down. That's what brought me to Virginia, was a position with the Hearings and Appeals Council, Social Security Administration. Hearings and Appeals analyst, was a paralegal track, and that involved, we were essentially ghostwriters for the appeals council members.
Mm-hmm.
So all we did was write decisions, and if you weren't comfortable, and back then it was pre-word processor or whatever, so you were given a legal pad and a pen and big files and go to it. So a lot of the sort of analyzing literature, reading a lot, putting it together, you know, and literally back in the day, cutting and pasting,
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of skills that I utilized, you know, with Appeals Council.
Yeah.
Thinking back, I learned those skills as a humanities major. When people say, well, and they similarly say it sometimes with Parks and Rec major, well, what are you going to be, a park ranger? I remember my dad even say, well, do you even need to go to school for that?
Yeah.
There's less sort of vocational connection with a humanities major, certainly. And we get into debates here. We're proud to say, well, our Parks and Rec majors have these particular jobs, but we're not a vocational school. The point is, whether you're a Parks and Rec major or a human stud, humanistic studies, you learn how to read, write, analyze. And I found, people say, well, certain universities have a pre-law major, which certainly in Hopkins they didn't. But some of the best, quote, pre-law preparation is something like an English major, where you have to read a tremendous amount and get your writing concise, and be able to write a lot on short notice. So you don't, I can't say writing's always difficult. It's always a challenge. They say the best writing is rewriting, but you don't experience that sort of writer's block, or some people are even paralyzed with the idea of writing anything.
Right.
I was able to get, that's what Hopkins experience and beyond helped me with.
Let me pursue or have you tell the viewers about the other aspects of your academic career beyond Johns Hopkins. Where did you, and you fit your studies and different types of work sort of, concurrently in different time frames. What happened to you academically beyond Hopkins?
It's sort of all comes together and makes sense in retrospect, but at the time, people would ask me, well, are you still in school? And in fact, I was always in school, in part because I had significant student loans from my Hopkins and first graduate school experience I'll describe. And frankly, it was cheaper to stay in school. When I was graduating from college, at the time my draft number was such that I was going to be drafted. So trying
In
to
other
make,
words, a low number.
yeah, make the best of a bad situation, I applied to the Officers Candidate School for the Navy and was accepted. But there was an 18-month wait to go to Newport.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, within 18 months, I could probably do a graduate program. So knowing that, because I thought I was going to go to the Navy right after graduation, I said, well, now I've got 18 months, what am I going to do? It was my final semester in college, so I was kind of late in taking the tests and applications. But I applied to a lot of programs in English, but English education, where you'd get a teaching certificate. Because coming out of Hopkins, you couldn't teach in public school because you weren't certified. So 2 weeks after I graduated from Hopkins, I started, it was a 15-month, 2 summers in a school year program at the University of Chicago. And in '73, I graduated from Chicago with a Master's of Arts in Teaching. And then the war was winding down, and frankly, the Navy said, we don't really need officers. So I put my application on hold, and I went to teach. I taught in Baltimore County for 1 year, and it was, you know, good learning experience in terms of teaching 5 classes, 5 days a week. I had about 140 students, 10th graders. But I was only 22 years old at the time, and I thought, well, I want to take a break. What am I going to do? Well, I knew if I wasn't working or in school, I was going to have to pay these loans. And at the time, I was in high school. I'd been a lifeguard at got certified from the YWCA, Northeast Philadelphia. So I started going to the Towson Y and swimming. Saw a fella there, and I thought, well, I like this environment more than the traditional school environment. And
Yeah.
I said, well, how did you get into this racket? And he said he had graduated from Springfield College, and I got a catalog from their institution. I saw their English department was mostly MATs, which I'd already had in my degree from Chicago. And I thought, well, maybe I could swing a deal and get some sort of assistantship, teach there,
Mm-hmm.
and get into this recreation sort of field. And I got some applications. I started looking more seriously at recreation programs. And when I was in Chicago during my student teaching, some of the fellows I was teaching, their older brothers and sisters, they'd go visit downstate, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and they'd always talk about, you know, what a big deal that was.
Yeah.
So I thought University of Maryland, because I was in Baltimore, would be the most obvious choice. They had a rec program. One of my colleagues at the high school, her brother was a rec major at Maryland. She would talk about it, and I said, well, that sounds pretty neat, you know, that you could actually major in that. And I wrote a letter to University of Maryland, and the woman at the time said, well, your background in rec is more in the sports aquatics area. I don't know why at this late date you would change careers. And she really kind of threw a damper on it. But I got a nice letter in talking to the law part from Betty Vandersmith, who was a chair at Penn State at the time. She said, well, we would like to think our rec majors are better.
And a renowned attorney.
Yeah, and she's also attorney. And I saw the JD sitting there, and I thought, well, that's pretty neat stuff. You know, here's this chair of a department, Penn State. I was from Pennsylvania. You know, has a law degree, and her letter was very encouraging. She said, you know, we like to see people from other disciplines, other areas to come in. And I got a similar sort of letter from the University of Illinois. And I think I had applied to Oregon and Illinois. And then I thought, what am I doing? You know, this is kind of nuts. I'm going to be giving up my job and, you know, taking off. So I already had 2 applications in, and I kind of stopped there. So I didn't apply to Penn State or Springfield College or what have you. And I didn't get in. I was rejected at Oregon. But I got a letter from Illinois, and I was accepted. And the thought was that I would get an assistantship. That was the expectation. But it turned out I didn't get it. But by that time, I didn't have a job. I had quit my job. And I can recall I called Joe Bannon out at Illinois. And I hadn't been dealing with Joe.
Yeah.
He wasn't aware of it. And he apologized, you know, because I said, hey, I thought I was going to get some assistance. I'm out of state. What am I going to do? And he said, well, I can't guarantee anything, but why don't you come out, and things happen. So I went out to University of Illinois, then it was Parks and Recreation Administration program. And I was paid out of state. The money I'd saved up was about exhausted, and I saw Joe, and I said, hey, Joe, I'm going to have to go home. I don't have any money. He said, well, let me try to find something for you. And I was working in the gyms at the time, all around. Campus recreation supervisor was the job. And Joe found a tuition and fee waiver for me, so that allowed me to stay, which was for the first year. And the second year, and Joe at one point said, you know, there are probably 25 PhDs in English for every university job out there. And he says, I know of 25 jobs in parks and recreation that our graduates can be placed in. And I started thinking, well, that's an idea, that's a thought. And so I decided to enroll in the doctoral program at Illinois, which I did. And my advisor at the time throughout was a good friend to this day, is Bob Espizet. And Bob had an assistantship quarter time, and he said, well, his assistant was leaving, so I got to be Bob's assistant. And one of the things Bob did during my time in Illinois was he told me to take an urban planning law course. And I'd taken a constitutional law course at Hopkins, pass-fail, and I'd almost failed. And I didn't really like it. But I didn't like it more because the people in there were posturing. They would bring briefcases, and the law was a really, you know, constitutional law thing. And I thought, well, some of these guys were really into it, and I just wasn't into it. So that wasn't, you know, law's not for me. Because at Hopkins, you know, the joke was if you don't go to med school, you go to law school, and that's pretty much a lot of my friends. You know, most of them are lawyers from those Hopkins days. So Bob said, well, why don't you take his urban planning law? And I did well in it, but I really didn't like it. It was a big class. Then the next semester, I needed a class, and lo and behold, it was a small seminar with the same teacher who happened to be an attorney. And I thought, well, why is this guy who's an attorney, he's doing this? And spring comes late, Champaign-Urbana, but I saw him one day riding his 3-speed bike, looking like he didn't have a care in the world, going to class. And I saw the law and the urban planning thing. And at the time, as I was Bob's assistant, it was in the Office of Recreation Park Resources, which was state extension, so it was involved with technical assistance. Mm-hmm. And a lot of inquiries were coming in that were law-related. And at the time, and to this day, in doctoral study in Parks and Rec, it was more leisure studies and sociological research types of things, questionnaires.
I think you've referred to that as counting smiles.
Yeah, counting smiles. And I could do it, but I really just didn't,
Wasn't where your head
was. And I saw this law thing sitting out there. And then when I took this second course, it was housing law, and it was a small course, and I did well. And I found myself thinking, well, gosh, I'm going to miss this. You know, this is the end. And I just thought, well, you know, maybe law school's the thing. But I also thought, well, it's, you know, time to make a living. My prospects of staying in Illinois or going to law school there, I think, were minimal. And so my hometown, if you will, having left Philly when I was 17, was Baltimore. And so I started looking into two law schools 6 blocks or so apart, University of Baltimore and University of Maryland, had night divisions. So my thought was, well, I'd apply to Maryland at night. If I didn't get in, as Baltimore accepted people in January, then I would fall and try to see if I could get in University of Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
So I applied, and I was leaving Champaign, and Joe Bannon said, well, look, if you ever decide to pick up your doctoral studies again, well, you ought to think of University of Maryland. You know, you're going back to Baltimore. And I said, Joe, University of Maryland blew me off. That's why I came here. You know, that was my state university. He said, oh, no, there's a new chair. There's a friend of mine's come here, and it's Fred Humphrey. So if you go back, you go see Fred, and you tell him, you know, that I sent you. And I said, okay. So it was in the back of my mind. While I was going back to Baltimore, I called a fella, one of my old fraternity brothers, who I'd lived with while I was teaching. He had a house that he rented, and I was going to go back there, and that was my, you know, domicile address that I'd kept. He said, there's a letter here from the University of Maryland Law School. Let me open it. I thought, well, I might as well get the news now on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And he said, you got in. And so I started night law school. And at the time, I mean, I was flat broke, and even in state at the time was $250 at night for the semester, and I didn't have it. I couldn't afford it. Well, my folks borrowed money in order to help me get in the first term in night school. And about 2 years in, I'd applied for the federal job. I took those as a PACE test. I did real well in that, and I was looking for a federal job, and I thought, well, you know, ideally something like the Park Service, you know, Interior Department. And I was picked up for the branch office job in the, you know, rough area of Baltimore with Social Security Administration. So I was working there, and I would check the job line for Interior. And actually, I'd applied for jobs, and I got one interview for Bureau of Land Management or something, and I took personal time to go for the interview, and it was clear it was wired, and I was sort of the out of, you know, department person.
You were the unwired.
Yeah, and I realized then that I was health and education welfare, now health and human services, but they're like separate planets as far as, well, I'll start in Social Security and I'll jump to Interior. That just isn't the way it works. But to try to keep my hand in, and I can recall people in night law school saying, well, hey, what are you going to, you know, Kaz, what are you interested in? Corporate, tax, estates and trusts? And I said, no, I said, Parks and Recreation. And they said, well, geez, what, you know, looked at me like I was deranged or something. And recent time, one of my friends was a administrative law judge in Health and Human Services. She had a 60th birthday party sort of thing, and I was invited, and she said, you know, you're one of the few of us who said what you were going to do, and I said, yeah, I'm going into Parks and Recreation law. I didn't know what it was, but that was my interest. So halfway through my night law school experience, I went down to Maryland and I met with Fred Humphrey. And I said, well, I've got night school, I've got about 2 years left and working in Social Security. He said, well, why don't you apply, and we won't expect to see you until 1980 when you finish your law degree, but you'll be in the program. So that was, I was admitted to the doctoral program, finished the law degree, got the job with hearings and appeals, and if you're a lawyer and you already have a lot of experience in Social Security, some of my colleagues who started law school after me, they're all administrative law judges now in Social Security Administration. So that was kind of the track I was on, and it was sort of, well, who am I kidding? You know, I know more Social Security law than Parks and Rec law. And I called Joe Bannon again, and I said, hey, Joe, you know, I want to be in Parks and Rec. I joined NRPA. I'd read the magazine, but I was a Social Security employee. And he said, well, look, why don't you call Barry Tyndall down in NRPA? He says, I'm sure as Barry has things that he would like to, you can't get to, and with your skill set, you know, you got your law degree, offer to help him out. So I did, and I can recall there were some budget rescissions going on, and you wanted somebody to look at the laws involved. And at the time I was living in an apartment house, which was right a block away from the now George Mason Law School. They had just taken over a failed international school of law in 1979. It was in an old department store. But they let the public use their law library, which a lot of law libraries won't do unless, you know, you're either a student or have a bar card. But
Yeah.
George Mason's always been good that way. So I went and put some research together and you know, gave it to you. And then I can recall I was in the health suite at Social Security. I was looking at the Post, and it was under congressional aid or something, and it was the job at NRPA. And I said, well, you know, I applied for that, and I can recall you saying, well, I want to see a writing sample. And sort of, again,
If I'd only known of your full background, I probably could have waived that.
yeah. Well, I had a writing requirement at the end of law school. Either take a course with a writing or do independent writing. So I recall I went to my old property professor and I said, I want to write an independent paper. He said, okay, you know, what are you interested in? And having, you know, followed the magazine, as I was a member now, I saw that the Urban Park Recreation Recovery Program was sort of coming on the block. And I applied for some of those recreation specialist jobs in UPAR.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I never got, you know, even a sniff out of that, but I knew it was out there. And I said, well, I'm going to write my paper on UPAR. He said, okay, fine. And what I did, it helped me, you know, prepare, I guess, for with NRPA and public policy. I got all the hearing records that were published by the various committees and like, and I read them all, and that was really the basis of my paper. But you had testified in there, and you know, the usual suspects from the, you know, environmental conservation community. So I started to get a feel for who the players were, how it worked out. And I can recall even then you were talking about a new president's commission, you know, pushing that idea that, you know, eventually came to fruition years later. To your credit, I thought, you know, in the particularly Republican administration, you were dreaming, but you know, it just shows that when we worked together, you were the optimist and I was the pessimist. But that's, you know, how that came about. And our checks were usually held up at the beginning of the fiscal year on the Hyde Amendment because of the anti-abortion language. So that was October 1st. So sort of you said, well, when do you want to start? When you offer me the job. And it, involved a pay cut, but it was like, hey, now I'm going to go. This is Parks and Recreation.
You're in the field.
Yeah, I'll be in the field, not just reading the magazine. And I said, well, I'll start October 1st, because that was the day that, our checks or whatever were going. So it was October 1st, 1980. And I can recall when I walked in the door, it was for the November magazine. You said, well, we have this column, the Washington Scene, and we need something now to write. And it was like my hearings and appeals experience, because once again I had a yellow pad and a pen, and it was go for it. And the first thing I wrote on it was the Rails to Trail legislation, Harley Staggers bill, and put that together and enjoyed that. My other duty was the newsletter, the Washington Action Report, and that involved what we call search and destroy missions, a lot of going down Capitol Hill. And the timing was such that that election, Reagan beat Carter. So early on in my tenure at NRPA, we had the whole new administration coming in, all the confirmation hearings with Jim Watt and the like, so I was attending all that stuff. But what was sort of interesting, my first Congress, when I went out in Phoenix, 80, Jim Bradamus, old colleague, professor from the University of Illinois, he said, hey, Koz, we got a job open. He gave me a job description. And I, really enjoyed my time at University of Illinois and that whole environment. So I thought, well, why not? I'll apply. So I applied to that position, never thinking anything would come of it. And I received, Joe Bannon at the time, I think was in South Africa or whatever, he was away. And I got a letter that said, well, when are you going to finish your PhD? And I said, well, I'm not. I've got a JD, which is a Juris Doctor, so that's not doctor enough. I guess I don't qualify.
Yeah.
Well, I heard back later, I checked with Joe, and Joe said that's fine. And lo and behold, I was surprised I was called for an interview, one of two people to be interviewed for this job. And I went, and my presentation was what we'd worked on as far as, and what I'd written for the magazine, the Washington Scene, was sort of an agenda for the next Congress, all the different bills and topics and issues. So that was sort of my presentation. Obviously, I didn't get the position. And, I was somewhat disappointed, because I really enjoyed my time at Champaign-Urbana. But I realized, well, what have I done? I mean, I've written a few Washington Scene columns. I enjoyed that, and working with you. I'd only been in NRPA less than a year, so I really haven't done anything. I haven't taught in Parks and Recreation. So while still working in NRPA, now I was out of law school. I was taking courses at the University of Maryland. I went and saw Fred Humphrey, and I said, hey, Fred, I said, you really ought to have a law course here in this program. And he said, well, I'd love to, but, I don't have any funds for adjuncts and that sort of thing. And I said, well, I'll do it for free. And in fact, I'll pay for independent study credits if you let me teach a course. And he said, yeah, I mean, how, make an offer you can't refuse. He said, go for it. At the time, there were no law books specific to Parks and Recreation that I was aware of. So I used my old torts text, because the legal issue that's on everybody's mind is, am I liable? The whole liability thing. So I took my old tort text, and I would try to fashion those cases and, okay, how would this relate to a Parks and Rec situation? And I was still doing research at the George Mason Law Library, starting to collect these cases in Parks and Recreation, thinking about a dissertation as well, and putting all these things together. Well, that course went well, And the students went to Fred and said, hey, we ought to have, more of this. And he said, I'm gonna find, adjunct money that course continued. And that was the beginning of the course that I still teach today here at George Mason all these years later. But around that same time, and as I was putting together a lot of these materials to Parks and Rec relation to supplement a classic just torts law case book that we were using, Pam Lee, who was the editor of the Parks and Rec magazine at the time, she was bemoaning the fact there was a department monthly feature in the magazine, been there for at least a couple years, called Safety Tips. I think the fellow who was writing it was a grad student in Oklahoma or whatever, but he was done, and he wasn't going to write safety tips anymore. You turn into the skid, and when you put your chains, it was that kind of thing, or chainsaws. And Pam said something like, what am I going to do? I need somebody to write a column. And I remember, we weren't even sitting down, I was in the hallway or whatever. I said, I'll write you a column. And she said, are you serious? I said, yeah, I'll write a column. She said, well, can you give me 2 years, if you commit to this? And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And, rightfully so, I can recall you saying, hey, you got a full-time job here. I was doing Washington Action Report, Washington Scene, doing all the, public policy stuff, answering the phones and holding hands for the membership, all the stuff. I think it was the two of us and maybe a secretary. So I said, no, I'm going to do it on my own time. So I can recall spending a lot of nights in the library, and I knew the first column that appeared in January '82 had to be good. And given Betty Vandersmithson's legacy, and she'd done such a good job in terms of liability, the perception was that, and it was a major concern, but that legal issues sort of began and ended in terms of Parks and Recreation with liability. So I thought, well, I've got to grab people's attention and show them there's a wild, wonderful world of legal topics beyond liability out there. And at the Congress that year in Minneapolis, there was a lot of talk among the therapeutic rec people of leisure counseling. And I can recall us hearing that there was a person, leisure counselor, that had been sued. And the papers were forwarded to us, and I said, she wasn't sued, she's being prosecuted. And smart educator types, leisure researchers, they were clueless in terms of this whole legal aspects. Can they do that? What? What? I said, yeah, she's being sued for unauthorized practice of it was family counseling. So based on that, that was my first article, January of '82. It was leisure counseling as the unauthorized practice of psychology. And that got a lot of attention right off the bat. It's one thing to talk about it and do it in a university setting, there's First Amendment right to do that. But when you hang out a shingle and start taking people's money, then that turf's been perhaps carved up. So that was the first article. And my idea was, in the first year, pick not liability areas, but different areas of the law, and really show, there's a lot more out there that's relevant to Parks and Rec. And at the time, NRPA was talking about professional certification, and that was a big issue. So I went into the civil rights, did a lot of research on that, and the point was that if you have educational requirements or pen and paper tests, they're per se discriminatory against women and minorities. So NRPA was saying, well, everybody has to have be certified, and I'm a big supporter of professional certification. But, you know, if an African American female shows up with a Harvard MBA and they tell her, hey, you can't be a Parks and Rec administrator because you're not certified, you haven't taken the test. I said, you know, you're dead meat. So I wrote up that piece, and at the time the Ethnic Minority Society, Jimmy Calloway, a close friend of mine, was in there. He jumped all over that, and he was taking it, you know, I can recall Don Hinkle had some heartburn over my article, and I shared it with you, and I was sitting in my office writing my Washington scene, Washington action report, doing all that sort of thing. And there was just this big commotion over this article that Pam was going to run, that I had turned in my draft. And you read it and said, yeah, it's on the money. And, you know, we went with it. But at that point, and we talked, and I said, okay, this obviously, I can do this. It's valuable information. I've been doing it at night, you know, and at the time I hadn't been married that long. And I thought, well, you know, my wife's been understanding, but I'm spending a lot of evenings in the law library putting this stuff together. So at that point, the law column became part of my position in 1982. Well, as it turns out, in 1983, there was a budget shortfall, and my position was eliminated in public policy. And I can recall Pam Lee saying, hey, I wouldn't blame you not writing the column, but what am I, you know, going to do? And I told her, I said, well, this now is my only connection with the field, so I'm going to keep writing it. But as luck would have it, when I lost my job, the weekend before, my wife and I, we had just purchased our first word processor, and it was like $3,000 for the printer, and that was a big investment. And now I lost my job, and I was thinking, well, maybe we can close the box up and return it and the like. And my wife said, no, this will give you an opportunity to work on your dissertation. We can get by on what I make, so, you know, do that. And actually, I learned how to use the word processor, an early word processor, no mouse or anything, it was all keystrokes. So April of '83 was my first column that came out. I think it was on sexual harassment, again, trying to show different aspects. But the last two columns I was writing before the riff took place, in '82 we had heard about the licensing groups, ASCAP, BMI, coming to the Parks and Rec people, saying that they owed licensing fees for playing music in the recreation centers, like at a roller rink or what have you. And I didn't take copyright law in law school, and so I was totally new to it. But I dove into it, did my research, found hearings, because the new copyright law had just come in '76. Actually went down to talk to committee staff on the Hill, and they told flat out, hey, there's no appetite for amending this thing. It took us 25 years to get a new one. But my last two articles on staff were related to music licensing for copyright. Jump way ahead to '92 when Dean Tice was executive director. And I was then a consultant with NRPA Public Policy, and on occasion working with you on public policy issues, that would give, you know, sort of the strategy and the topic for a law column, something that we were involved in, knowing that if it came in the law column, membership would be brought up to speed on it. So this copyright music issue was one that never went away. And I believe it was in '92, I wrote a letter for Dean Tice under his signature to the Copyright Council, saying that we thought, although there's no longer a nonprofit exemption, that Parks and Rec should be exempt if you don't use private performers. And it was under this what's called 110.4 exception, and that was the pitch. And we got a letter back, and the Copyright Council said, yeah, I basically agree with you. Well, that letter was reformulated and became, I think it was February '92 column. Skip ahead to, I think it was 2008, I wrote a fourth article. And those articles now are on my Mason website. I've actually done a video lecture here with the GMU TV people. So you have four law articles, a lecture on this one issue. So of all the 30 years now of columns, 360 columns, a lot of different issues, but that one has had some real legs to it, such that I've put the material on my website because we would get so many calls from attorneys and directors around the country.
Yeah, I recall that, and let me sort of move from questions to you just for a second to because I think the value of these tapes is that a lot of people hopefully will see them. Can you tell people how they can get a hold of your work electronically?
Yeah, I mean, right now, even if you just Google my name, James C. Kozlowski, and if you even want to put JD, PhD after it, one of the first hits comes up is to my web page here at George Mason University. And on that web page, keeping in mind, because most of my courses here are televideo courses, and it's I teach not only sport and rec law, which is primarily liability issues, but natural resources law, which has a parks resource focus, and disability rights law and therapeutic recreation, which is primarily focused on Americans with Disabilities Act. Most of the materials in those courses are old law columns that have been stitched together, and I do video lectures here at GMU TV, and those are linked to the website. Again, for purposes for my students, but anybody in the world, in fact, can use those and see the lectures and the links to the materials. I also, some of the early articles have yet to be posted, but I have an archive on my Mason webpage of all my past law review articles in Parks and Recreation going back to January of 1982, and tried to divide it up by a topical index. And oftentimes when I get inquiries from around the country, Parks and Rec administrators, they'll even say, well, have you ever written about something, or they'll ask me some sort of topic, and I can usually paste in, just links on my web page to those particular articles. And recently, and again, they sort of fit in themes, recurring themes. Most recently, there have been a couple of cases involving, quote, anti-camping ordinances, which are really targeting the homeless, and unfortunately, no place to go. The homeless go to the parks. And those are oftentimes suspect or attacked on constitutional grounds. And I've written some articles in the past. These are some of the more recent ones. But each one sort of themes and variations. And so my thought for the field, and I don't write for lawyers, and I don't teach law students, but my hope is that make the law more accessible, understandable, and one article may give you an idea of what's going on, but when I have 3 or 4, like in the case of the copyright music issue, I think it gives folks a good handle, toward layperson of how this operates, and what a lot of people have done with this information, and I certainly appreciate it. It's provided a bridge for them to go to agency counsel and say, hey, this was in my professional magazine, what relevance has it to us? And I always caution, it is a magazine article, and a lot of these things tend to be certain issues, jurisdiction specific. It's not offered as legal advice or legal opinion. I just want to, as law review or law reporter, for a number of years, I published through NRPA a quarterly, which was just case reports, the Recreation Parks Law Reporter, focused primarily on liability and injury type issues. But I think it raised awareness in the field that there is still quite a bit of governmental immunity out there in the liability area. And that's, there's a contribution I wanted to make, is to raise the legal literacy. Because when I was in my recreation program in Illinois, there was always this feeling of, hey, you do your job right, you're a smart person, but there's this law out there, and it can get you. And it was sort of mysterious and threatening when the lawyers, and at the time, it was almost, you either had to go to law school or go to federal prison to even get access to a law library. Nowadays, with the internet, a lot of that information is accessible. And reading actual cases, yeah, they're written in a certain way. It's sort of tough to start. But what I try to do is take the actual court opinion, keep the integrity of it as much sense as possible, but clean it up, arrange it such that you can read it and understand it. That's sort of been my approach in the law column all these years.
I'm going to read a short quotation that I just learned is on your Facebook page,
Yeah.
and you've sort of certainly filled in a lot of the gaps here. Quotation reads, "A law that might look like a wall to you or me will look like a triumphal arch to the experienced eye of a lawyer."
Yeah, and that was when I applied to Maryland. They said at the time catalogs, and that was one of the quotes and I actually had to, they're online now, but I had to go back and find that catalog from the year I applied to find that quote, because that always struck in my mind, and I really have had the experience that even going back to my days Social Security, which is law-based, that things that seem impenetrable or unfair or totally confusing to people and beyond understanding, once you kind of have the skills and tear it down, basic legal research skills that aren't really that difficult. If you can do internet searches, you can do a lot of this. You can find the information, put it together, and I always say, well, in terms of, just like you wouldn't do surgery on yourself, you don't practice law on yourself, but even the non-lawyer can have a fairly high level of legal literacy, looking at this information, learning some skills. Said that, your jailhouse lawyers with elementary school education, they have a lot of time on their hand, but they get pretty good at habeas corpus and things, issues in the area. So I think, just like physical fitness, the more you know about your body, the better you can maintain your health and work with your doctor. I think, that should be the same way in terms of the law. And I'm always amazed in our educational system. You can go K through PhD, and you have to read Hamlet or what have you. But chances are that you've never been exposed to the law, and even pretty intelligent people, and we run into this in the advocacy area, have little more of that, of an 8th grade civics understanding of how government works. You know, that there's a Senate and a House, and maybe there's the same thing at the state level. You know, they're confused in that sense, and yet we live in a framework, particularly in Parks and Recreation, is a creature of the law. It's a legal environment, and you look at the number of legal issues that, because I do searches just Parks and Recreation, and sure, liability is an issue, but you know, things like constitutional law with the homeless, or competing with the private sector. You know, we ran into that. Oh, you can't compete
Sure.
with the private sector. So to give people an idea, and I think this ignorance of the law, not only is it no excuse, but in the professional sense, sometimes it's used as an excuse for not offering opportunities. Like, oh, we can't do that because we'll be liable. Or that's clear, you know, the perception of liability is much worse than the reality. Or in terms of a general citizenry, you see the law, you know, witness the Occupy Wall Street and the like, is you see it as totally unfair and rigged, you know, and how much justice can you afford, and looking down upon, you know, the judicial system and lawyers. And that's really scary, let alone unfortunate, in terms of a well-informed citizenry. You know, people talk about free speech and the Constitution and the like, but how much do they really understand it? You know, now a lot of these demonstrations are occurring in the parks and public places. Well, that's one of the issues that I've visited, so much so that I put together a course here at Mason, Bill of Rights issues in parks and public places. And it focuses primarily on demonstrations in the parks, and, you know, how much rights you have, or the absolute, in terms of police actions and the like. But unfortunately, when that information appears in the popular media, it's often kind of sensationalistic and distorted. You know, you'll hear about a case being filed for $1 million. Some guy gets hurt or killed in a park. But, and my own experience was, I went out to West Virginia and I gave my presentation on liability, saying, you know, liability is the exception rather than the rule. And they said, well, did you hear about that case that fool climbed a power tower and got electrocuted and sued the park agency and got $1 million? Well, this was in the fall. Turns out, come December, the West Virginia Supreme Court reports that particular case, and guess what? It was dismissed. He got nothing. But what sticks in the minds of the people was that headline when it was filed,
initial
or the
headline.
jury
Yeah,
verdict, that
yeah.
he got some, you know, like my torts professor would say, the law protects a fool but not a damn fool. Well, this was a damn fool, and he still got his $1 million. Well, really, he didn't. I reported that Supreme Court case in the law column, but I doubt if it appeared in the newspapers.
Yeah. Jim, you've been awfully generous with your advice, with your sharing of professional and personal perspectives with you. I want to wrap up by asking you to comment briefly on 3 things that occur in some notes you gave me earlier under the heading of advice.
Okay.
I just ask you to comment on each one. The first was look for support.
Well, I think.
I can give you some keywords if that
Yeah,
would.
but you know, Hillary Clinton said, you know, it takes a village, and really, you know, and you'd be certainly in my village. And I thought, you know, going through, you know, some of the names I've brought up today, and you know, my colleagues, former colleagues at NRPA, like, you know, Ken Blumenthal, and My late Fred Humphrey was like, losing my dad again when he passed away, and Joe Bannon and the like. I think that's in Parks and Recreation, and I was humbled and honored by even invited to do this Legends interview, because I look at the list of people, many of whom I have known, and they were kind of my inspiration and heroes in this field, and all really good people. I mean, just nice people that if you ask them, just like I'd ask, hey Joe, Joe Bannon, I'm not in the field, what can I do? He would contact this person or that person, and that networking. And I think that's part of, people say, well, what do you get like from being in NRPA besides a magazine? Is that opportunity to network, to get to know people. And that's been one of the real satisfactions of being in this field. It is a fun field, and they're really intelligent people out there that'll help you out and give you an opportunity. Not if you just sit and wait. Like I was thinking, well, hey, I have a law degree. Nobody's asked me to do anything. And it was sort of that realization after, the Illinois position was like, hey, I haven't done anything. I got to get out there. I got to strut my stuff and show what I got, because frankly, no one had ever written a law column.
Yeah. And I would quickly add the American Academy as a great networking
Oh, absolutely.
community as
I
well.
mean, and again, the people that are in there, you just look at the names and what they've done.
You've talked a lot about how some of your, maybe much of your career has been has resulted from being on the right side of happenstances, good happenstances, things like that. Your second piece of advice is your benefits should outweigh your costs. That suggests contributions and a lot of things that clearly have marked your career.
Going back, and the first time, as I mentioned, I taught at Maryland. I did it for free. First time I taught here at George Mason, I did the same thing. And the thing was to get the opportunity. If you sit and say, well, yeah, I'm willing to do that, what can you pay me? And going back to when I first met you, and I said, hey, I can do some research for you. And you said, hey, I need some information on rescissions law and budget law. Can you help me out? And if I said, yeah, here's my billable hours or something, you'd say, hey, I can't.
I would have remained ignorant.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and if you enjoy what you're doing, part of the pay is in terms of human capital and getting the opportunity to strut your stuff to the point where in your own mind you're convinced, but others will buy in and say, hey, you could be a valuable player here. Even here at George Mason University, it took me years and years and years, but I started out as an adjunct, then I was a super adjunct, then I was half-time, then I was full-time. And when I was an adjunct, I was teaching 3 courses a year, at least, sometimes 4. That's almost a full load. Meanwhile, I was an adjunct at the University of Maryland and Gallaudet University. So for just a fraction, and I still had to have a day job doing other things, doing all kinds of consulting work, but that provided me with the opportunity to effectively create your own opportunity and position.
Yeah. Jim, and the last one, be prepared to give it away and persist.
Yeah, and that fits with the same thing.
Somewhat.
That with, and using the analogy with people understand a struggling musician or artist, they typically work for free, and they work in the coffee shop at day and play every gig they can at night for free in order to develop their sound and develop their following and get that opportunity before they even make a dime. People understand that, but the same sort of situation arises if you want to be in parks and recreation law, and then people look at you and say, well, that doesn't even exist. You only need one job and one career, and if you stick with it long enough, and you need support. He said my wife supported me throughout and bought into this whole adventure, which I couldn't have done without her. You still have to make a living. But if you like what you're doing, in Parks and Rec, I mean, they call it work, but when I've thought my other positions, you know, in Social Security, I thought, well, is there something else I'd rather be doing? Always something came to mind. But in this field, I've never really thought I'd rather be doing something different. So it's easier to give it away when it's something you like doing, playing your music or, you know, talking about parks and recreation law.
Well, your conversation this afternoon has certainly enlightened a lot of people I know, and brought back a lot of memories of the fun times that
It's been a fun ride.
you and I had. And I remembered, and I know you will recall, lots of jokes and stories and things we could talk about with interns, Marie Howard and a number of others that we had a lot of good times with. I have been honored to be involved in this conversation with Jim, and I hope that the Academy and National Rec and Park Association will share this conversation as broadly as it can. Thank you and have a good day.